Deafening roars from twin turbines rattled the stained glass windows of St. Jude's Cathedral, completely drowning out the choir. Father Gregory Townsend stood at the altar, pale and trembling, having just ordered security to cast the weeping bride in her thrift store dress onto the street. He had called her worthless and mocked her poverty. Yet as the massive shadows of three black crest-emblazoned helicopters engulfed the church courtyard, the arrogant priest was about to realize he had just humiliated the most powerful woman in the world. Newport, Rhode Island was a city built on the concept of exclusion. Its sweeping oceanic cliffsides were dominated by Gilded Age mansions, monuments of limestone and marble where the descendants of railway tycoons and modern hedge fund billionaires spent their summers in opulent isolation. It was a place where lineage was currency and bank accounts were the ultimate measure of a human soul. In the shadows of these grand estates lived the invisible workforce that kept the city pristine. Clara Higgins was one of them. Clara was 23 with a quiet, resilient grace that seemed almost out of place against her harsh circumstances. She spent her days covered in flour at the Harbor Bakehouse, arriving at 4 in the morning to knead dough for the brioche and croissants that the wealthy elite would casually pick at during their morning brunches. She lived in a cramped, drafty studio apartment situated above a noisy laundromat on the wrong side of the harbor. Clara had no family. She had grown up in the brutal foster care system of Boston, passed from one overcrowded home to another, clutching only a tarnished silver locket that she had worn around her neck since she was abandoned at a fire station as an infant. Despite the endless grind of poverty, Clara's world was colored with a profound, radiant hope. That hope had a name: Henry. Henry Caldwell worked at the local shipyard, a mechanic whose hands were perpetually stained with engine oil and marine grease. He was a man of few words but fierce loyalty, possessing a rugged, salt-of-the-earth kindness that had immediately captivated Clara when they first met 3 years ago. Henry had walked into the bakery soaked to the bone from a sudden nor'easter, and Clara had given him a free cup of black coffee and a leftover pastry. From that moment, they were inseparable. They bonded over their shared invisibility in a town that worshipped visibility. When Henry proposed to Clara on a rain-swept pier, slipping a modest second-hand cubic zirconia ring onto her finger, Clara felt like the richest woman on earth. They didn't need a grand ballroom or a $100,000 catering budget. They only wanted one thing: to be married in St. Jude's Cathedral. St. Jude's was the crown jewel of Newport's architecture. Built in the late 1800s, it featured breathtaking Gothic arches, imported Italian marble floors, and stained glass windows crafted by European masters. For Clara, the cathedral represented a lifelong secret fantasy. As a little girl in the foster system, she had seen a magazine clipping of a bride walking down the aisle of St. Jude's. She had taped that clipping to the wall next to her cot, dreaming that one day, she too would be worthy of standing in a place so beautiful, swearing her life to someone who truly loved her. However, St. Jude's was not merely a house of worship. It was the exclusive domain of Father Gregory Townsend. Father Townsend was a man who had long ago confused piety with prestige. After 20 years of ministering to Newport's upper crust, he had grown accustomed to 5-course dinners at the yacht club, generous parish donations that funded his lavish lifestyle, and rubbing shoulders with politicians and celebrities. To Father Townsend, his church was a velvet-roped VIP lounge, and he was the bouncer. He judged his congregation not by their devotion, but by their net worth. When Clara and Henry first walked into the parish office to inquire about a wedding date, the priest's eyes immediately darted to Henry's scuffed steel-toe boots and the frayed hem of Clara's plain cotton dress. The couple was a glaring stain on the polished mahogany aesthetic of his office. "We want to be married in the eyes of God, Father," Clara said, her voice trembling with excitement as she held Henry's rough hand. "We've saved up for the standard parish fee." Father Townsend leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his manicured fingers. His smile was thin, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. He did not see two young people in love. He saw a pair of penniless nobodies who would bring no value, no donations, and no prestige to his beloved cathedral. The gears in his mind immediately began to turn, calculating exactly how he could crush this poor girl's dream without violating the strict letter of church law. The initial meeting had ended with Father Townsend offering a non-committal promise to review the calendar. But as the months passed and Clara's chosen date in early October approached, the priest's tactics shifted from passive dismissal to active sabotage. Clara and Henry had scraped together every spare dollar they had. They skipped meals. They walked instead of taking the bus. Henry took on double shifts at the shipyard, coming home exhausted and bruised just to afford the mandatory marriage counseling classes and the basic ceremony fees Father Townsend had quietly inflated. Then 3 weeks before the wedding disaster struck, Clara and Henry were summoned to the rectory on a Tuesday evening. Father Townsend sat behind his massive desk, flanked by the parish administrator. He didn't even offer them a seat. "I'm afraid there has been an administrative error." Father Townsend began, his tone dripping with faux sympathy. "The date you requested, October 12th, was actually reserved a year in advance by the Harrington family. It seems my secretary made a grave oversight in penciling you in." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The Harrington family was local royalty. Chloe Harrington, the spoiled, viciously entitled daughter of a telecommunications billionaire, was known throughout Newport for her extravagant tantrum-filled demands. "But Father," Henry interjected, his jaw tightening. "We have the confirmation receipt. We paid the deposit 6 months ago. We've already sent out the invitations to our friends. A deposit for a slot that was not truly available." "Mr. Caldwell," the priest replied smoothly, pushing an envelope across the desk. "Here is your refund. I suggest you look into the community center downtown. It is far more suited to your particular budget." "We don't want the community center," Clara pleaded, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "Father, please. I've dreamed of walking down the aisle at St. Jude's since I was a little girl. We'll take any other time that day. We'll get married at 6 in the morning if we have to. We just want the blessing of the church." Father Townsend sighed, a theatrical display of exhaustion. "Clara, marriage is a sacred institution. It requires stability, financial stability, spiritual maturity. Frankly, looking at your backgrounds, neither of you has family support. You, Clara, are an orphan with no pedigree, no familial foundation. Mr. Caldwell is a day laborer. What kind of foundation is that for a holy union? St. Jude's represents a standard. We cater to families who support the long-term viability of this parish." Henry stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Are you saying we aren't rich enough for God, Father?" "I am saying," Townsend snapped, dropping the polite facade, "that I will not allow my cathedral to be cheapened. Chloe Harrington's wedding will bring a $50,000 donation to our restoration fund. Can you match that, Mr. Caldwell? No. Then the matter is closed. You will not be married at St. Jude's, not on October 12th, and not on any other day." The cruelty of the priest's words struck Clara like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest where the silver locket rested beneath her shirt. Father Townsend wasn't just canceling their wedding. He was erasing their humanity. He was telling them that because they were poor, they were unworthy of grace. As they walked out into the cold Newport night, Clara broke down. She sat on the stone steps of the cathedral, burying her face in her hands, weeping for the little girl in the foster home whose dream had just been violently crushed by the very man supposed to represent divine love. Henry wrapped his heavy, warm arms around her, kissing the top of her head. "We don't need him, Clara," Henry whispered fiercely. "We'll get married by a justice of the peace. I love you. That's all that matters. It's not just the church, Henry," she sobbed. "It's what he said, that we don't matter, that because I don't know where I come from, because I don't have a family name, I'm nothing." Little did Clara know the tarnished silver locket she gripped so tightly in her trembling hands bore a faded microscopic crest, a crest that belonged to a family far older, far wealthier, and far more powerful than anyone in the affluent zip code of Newport could ever comprehend. October 12th arrived beneath a canopy of oppressive stormy gray clouds. The coastal winds whipped off the Atlantic, thrashing the manicured trees lining the streets of Newport. At St. Jude's Cathedral, preparations for the Harrington wedding were in full swing. Fleets of florists carried thousands of imported white orchids into the sanctuary. Valets set up velvet ropes. Father Townsend stood at the grand entrance in his finest vestments. His chest puffed with pride as he prepared to welcome billionaire senators and socialites into his domain. Across town, in her tiny apartment, Clara stood in front of a cracked mirror. She was wearing a vintage lace wedding gown she had found at a thrift store for $40. It was slightly frayed at the hem, and she had spent the last 3 nights meticulously restitching the bodice herself. She wore no makeup, only a simple sweep of her hair pinned back, allowing her mother's silver locket to rest prominently against her collarbone. Henry stood behind her, wearing a rented suit that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders. He looked at her in the mirror, his eyes shining with profound adoration. "You're the most beautiful woman in the world," he said softly. "Henry," Clara said, her voice shaking with a sudden desperate resolve, "I want to go to the church." "Clara, I don't want to force our way in," she explained, turning to face him. "But I want to stand on the steps. I want to say our vows right there outside the doors. I won't let Father Townsend make me feel like a stray dog hiding in an alley. We deserve to be there even if we're just on the sidewalk." Henry stared at her, seeing the fierce, unbreakable spirit that had made him fall in love with her. He nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, Clara, we go together." When Henry's beat-up 1998 sedan pulled up to the curb outside St. Jude's, the contrast could not have been more jarring. Blacktown cars and stretch limousines lined the street. Paparazzi and local society reporters were gathered behind barricades, eager to catch a glimpse of Chloe Harrington's diamond-encrusted gown. Clara and Henry stepped out into the biting wind. Holding hands, they began to walk up the massive stone steps of the cathedral. They didn't try to enter. They simply stopped halfway up, facing each other, ready to exchange the vows they had written on crumpled pieces of notebook paper. But Father Townsend spotted them from the vestibule. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. To him, this wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an act of extreme defiance. It was a visual blemish on his perfect high society event. "Get them out of here," Townsend hissed to the private security guards hired by the Harrington family. "Remove those vagrants immediately. The bride is arriving in 10 minutes. 3 burly men in black suits descended the steps. "You two need to move along," the lead guard barked, stepping between Clara and Henry. "We aren't bothering anyone." Henry said, his voice calm but dangerously low as he stepped in front of Clara. "We're on public property right here. We just want 5 minutes to say our vows." "I don't care what you want, pal. The priest wants you gone." The guard sneered violently, shoving Henry backward. Henry stumbled, and as Clara reached out to catch him, the second guard grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly. The sheer force of the grab tore the delicate lace of her thrifted sleeve. Clara cried out, her foot slipping on the damp stone steps. She fell hard onto her knees, scraping them raw against the granite. The silver locket burst open upon impact, with the stone revealing the tiny, faded portrait of a woman wearing a glittering tiara inside. "Stop it!" Henry roared, lunging forward, but 2 guards tackled him to the pavement, pinning him down, as the society guests on the sidewalk began to point and whisper, pulling out their phones to record the humiliating spectacle. Father Townsend marched down the steps, towering over Clara as she knelt on the ground, weeping, clutching her torn dress. "I warned you." The priest spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I told you that you do not belong here. Look at you, a pathetic, dirty little girl playing dress-up. You are ruining a sacred elite celebration. You are nothing to this parish, and you are nothing in the eyes of the people who matter. Now get off my steps before I have you arrested for trespassing." Clara looked up at the priest, tears streaming down her face, the cruel reality of the world breaking her heart into 1,000 pieces. She reached out her trembling fingers, attempting to gather the broken pieces of her locket from the cold stone. Suddenly, the wind changed. It wasn't a coastal breeze. It was a violent, rhythmic downward pressure that began to rattle the very foundations of the street. The trees violently whipped back and forth. The paparazzi stopped filming Clara and looked up at the sky in confusion. The heavy thumping whump, whump, whump of military-grade aviation rotors echoed off the limestone walls of the cathedral. 3 massive matte black Sikorsky helicopters descended from the low cloud cover. They were not news choppers. They were not local police. They were international sovereign transport vehicles. and emblazoned on the side of each aircraft was a gleaming crest of gold and crimson, the royal coat of arms of the House of Valerius. The society guests shrieked and scattered as the lead helicopter ignored all FAA regulations, hovering directly over the cathedral's courtyard, its landing gear deploying right in the middle of the Harrington family's precious floral arrangements. The downdraft sent thousands of white orchids flying into the air like a blizzard. Father Townsend shielded his eyes, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock as the massive aircraft touched down on the pristine cobblestone. The side door of the lead helicopter slid open, and 6 men in immaculate tailored tactical suits stepped out, forming a perimeter. Then a ramp extended. An elderly woman emerged. She was flanked by an entourage, but she walked with the posture of someone who owned the earth she stepped on. She wore a tailored Chanel coat, and leaning on a silver-tipped cane, her piercing blue eyes immediately locked onto the steps of the cathedral. It was Queen Beatrice of Valerius. The crowd fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Why was a European monarch landing at a society wedding in Rhode Island? Queen Beatrice didn't look at the billionaires. She didn't look at the paparazzi. She didn't look at Father Townsend. Her eyes bypassed all the wealth and superficial glamour, landing squarely on the weeping girl in the torn lace dress kneeling on the stone. The queen's gaze dropped to the ground where the broken locket lay on the steps. She let out a soft, shuddering gasp. "My God!" The queen whispered, her voice carrying an authority that silenced the wind itself. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Clara. "Get your hands off my granddaughter." The silence that fell over the courtyard of St. Jude's Cathedral was absolute, profound, and terrifyingly heavy. The deafening hum of the massive Sikorsky helicopter engines was slowly spinning down, yet the ringing in the ears of the assembled high society guests remained. For a moment, the world seemed to have entirely stopped on its axis. Queen Beatrice of Valerius did not wait for an invitation, nor did she wait for the stunned security guards to process her command. She moved with a formidable, unyielding grace, her silver-tipped cane clicking sharply against the damp, cold cobblestone with every step she took toward the cathedral's grand stone staircase. Her royal guards men, who were trained in the most elite military academies in Europe, immediately fanned out their hands, resting cautiously near their holstered weapons. The message was glaringly clear. Anyone who dared to intervene would face severe international consequences. The 3 burly private security guards who had just brutally pinned Henry Caldwell to the ground suddenly looked up. The aggressive, sneering bravado they had proudly displayed only moments before instantly evaporated, replaced by a visceral, cold panic. The lead guard slowly raised his hands, backing away from Henry, as if the mechanic had suddenly caught fire. Henry scrambled to his feet, ignoring his own scraped elbows and bruised jaw, and immediately rushed to Clara's side. Clara Higgins was still kneeling on the unforgiving granite steps, her breathing shallow and erratic. She was trembling violently in the harsh autumn wind, clutching the torn, frayed lace of her cheap thrift store wedding dress. She looked up at the impeccably dressed monarch approaching her, her mind unable to comprehend the surreal, impossible reality unfolding before her eyes. Queen Beatrice stopped just 2 feet away from the trembling girl. The elderly monarch's piercing blue eyes, which had commanded parliaments and stared down foreign dignitaries, were now swimming with heavy, unconcealed tears. Slowly, painfully, the queen lowered herself to the cold, damp stone steps, ignoring the frantic gasps of her personal aides who worried for her fragile knees. The queen reached out with a trembling, heavily veined hand, her fingers adorned with priceless, ancient sapphire rings. She gently picked up the broken pieces of the tarnished silver locket that Clara had dropped upon impact. The tiny clasp had snapped open, revealing the incredibly faded miniature portrait inside. It was a picture of a beautiful young woman wearing a glittering diamond tiara holding a swaddled infant. "My beautiful boy," Queen Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking with decades of buried, agonizing grief. "My Edward, he gave this to her." The queen looked up from the broken locket and stared directly into Clara's tear-streaked face. She studied the sharp curve of Clara's cheekbones, the deep emerald green of her eyes, and the stubborn set of her jaw. It was like looking into a living, breathing mirror reflecting the past. You have your mother's eyes, the queen said, her voice barely more than a ragged breath. But you have my stubborn chin. Oh, my sweet lost child, I have spent 23 years searching the ends of this earth for you. Clara recoiled slightly, pressing her back against Henry's legs. I don't understand. I'm Clara. I work at the Harbor Bakery. I don't have a family. I was left at a fire station in Boston. You were stolen. Queen Beatrice corrected her, the sorrow in her voice suddenly giving way to a fierce, undeniable royal anger. Your father, Prince Edward, and your mother, Princess Catherine, were killed in what we were told was a tragic motoring accident on a coastal highway in Massachusetts. They told me my infant granddaughter had perished in the terrible fire that consumed the vehicle. They lied. The political enemies of our throne tried to erase my bloodline. They hid you in the shadows of the foster system, hoping you would be lost to history forever. But the private investigators I hired never stopped looking. 3 days ago, a pawn shop owner in Boston scanned a photo of this very locket into an international database while trying to appraise a similar piece. The crest triggered an alert. And now I have finally found you. You are not Clara Higgins. You are Princess Clarissa Beatrice of the House of Valerius, the sole rightful heir to the throne. A collective dramatic gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of Newport elites. The socialites, who had just minutes ago looked at Clara with total disdain, now stared at her in utter, unadulterated awe. Father Gregory Townsend, standing near the vestibule doors, felt the blood completely drain from his face. His stomach dropped so violently he thought he might vomit. He had just ordered his security to physically assault the future queen of a sovereign European nation. He had called her a vagrant. He had told her she was worthless, dirty, and utterly devoid of pedigree. The crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake began to suffocate him. Townsend's survival instincts, honed by years of manipulating high society, suddenly kicked in. He smoothed the front of his expensive silk vestments and hurried down the steps, forcing a sickeningly sweet, sycophantic smile onto his pale face. Your Majesty. Your Majesty, please. Father Townsend cried out, bowing deeply, practically bending entirely in half. What an absolute miracle, a glorious divine intervention on the steps of my humble parish. We had absolutely no idea who this dear precious child was. If we had known of her royal lineage, we would have immediately rolled out the red carpet. Please, allow me to escort the princess inside to my private chambers where she can rest and be treated with the utmost dignity she deserves. Queen Beatrice slowly stood up, relying on her silver-tipped cane. She did not look at the priest immediately. Instead, she gently placed her warm hand against Clara's cold cheek, wiping away a stray tear. Then the monarch slowly turned her head to face Father Townsend. The warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by an icy, terrifying glare that could have frozen the nearby Atlantic Ocean. I heard everything you said to my granddaughter before my aircraft touched down, priest. Queen Beatrice said, her voice ringing out loudly, echoing off the stone walls for all the reporters and paparazzi to capture perfectly on their microphones. I heard you call her dirty. I heard you call her a stray. I heard you declare that she was entirely unworthy of stepping foot inside your supposed house of God. Your Majesty, I was merely protecting the sanctity of the scheduled events. Townsend stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead, ruining his perfectly combed hair. There was a terrible misunderstanding. The Harrington family had booked this time for their daughter's nuptials. I was only following the parish administrative schedule. Right on cue, a massive, obnoxious stretch limousine pulled up behind the row of helicopters. The doors flew open, and Richard Harrington, the ruthless telecommunications billionaire, stormed out. Following close behind him was his daughter Chloe Harrington, wearing an obscenely large, custom-designed Vera Wang gown covered in thousands of Swarovski crystals. Chloe was red in the face, furious that her grand entrance had been completely upstaged by military helicopters. What is the meaning of this? Richard Harrington bellowed, his face purple with rage, completely oblivious to the royal crests on the aircraft. Townsend, I paid $50,000 to secure this cathedral for my daughter. Why is there a circus on the lawn? And why are those two homeless beggars still on the steps? Get them out of here, Mas Autumn. Chloe stomped her satin-clad foot. Daddy, tell them to move those ugly black helicopters. They're ruining my aesthetic. My photographer can't get a clear shot of the cathedral doors. Queen Beatrice turned her terrifying gaze toward the Harrington family. The Royal Guard captain, a massive scar-faced man named Arthur, instinctively stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his sidearm. "You must be Mr. Harrington." Queen Beatrice said, her voice dripping with lethal, refined condescension. "I am Queen Beatrice of Valerius, and you are interrupting a royal family reunion." Richard Harrington stopped dead in his tracks. The arrogance drained from his eyes as he finally recognized the woman standing before him. As a billionaire who frequently did business in Europe, he knew exactly who the House of Valerius was. They didn't just have money. They possessed sovereign immunity, ancient political power, and a banking empire that could crush his telecommunications company before lunch. Your Majesty," Harrington stuttered, instantly shrinking into himself. I apologize. I had no idea. We were just arriving for my daughter's wedding." "There will be no wedding for your spoiled daughter today," the Queen announced coldly. "But we paid for the cathedral," Chloe shrieked, entirely lacking her father's survival instincts. "It's my special day. You can't just take it from me." Queen Beatrice didn't even dignify the shrieking bride with a response. She simply raised her hand and snapped her fingers. Captain Arthur immediately stepped forward, pulling a crisp, heavily embossed leather folder from his tactical vest. "Father Townsend," Captain Arthur said, his voice booming across the courtyard. 30 minutes ago, the Royal Banking Trust of Valerius finalized a transaction with the Archdiocese of New England. We have paid off the entire mortgage of St. Jude's Cathedral, including all adjacent properties, rectory buildings, and community centers. Furthermore, Her Majesty has pledged an endowment of $20 million to the diocese under one very strict non-negotiable condition. Father Townsend's jaw dropped. $20 million. It was a sum he could not even begin to fathom. A condition?" he whispered weakly. Yes," Queen Beatrice said, stepping forward until she was inches from the trembling priest. "The condition is that you are permanently removed from your position, defrocked, and immediately banished from this parish. You have corrupted this sanctuary with your disgusting greed. You have forgotten that a church is a sanctuary for the broken and the poor, not a country club for the wealthy. Pack your bags, Gregory. You are finished." The declaration hit the crowd like a shockwave. Father Gregory Townsend, the untouchable elite gatekeeper of Newport's high society, fell to his knees on the cobblestone, burying his face in his hands as he began to weep uncontrollably. His entire life, his prestige and his power had been completely dismantled in less than 60 seconds. Richard Harrington grabbed his screaming, protesting daughter by the arm and practically dragged her back toward their stretch limousine, desperate to escape the wrath of the foreign monarch. The billionaire knew a losing battle when he saw one. The paparazzi's cameras flashed rapidly, capturing every single humiliating second of the Harrington family's retreat and the corrupt priest's absolute downfall. Amidst the chaos, Clara stood completely still. The reality of the situation was too massive, too overwhelming to process. She looked down at her scraped knees, the torn lace of her dress, and the grease-stained hands of the man who had stood between her and danger. Henry was staring at the Queen, completely speechless, his protective arms still wrapped tightly around Clara's waist. Queen Beatrice turned her attention back to Clara. The coldness in her face vanished again, replaced by the tender, desperate love of a grandmother who had finally found her lost treasure. "Clarissa," the Queen said softly, extending her hand. "My sweet girl, your long nightmare is over. I have a medical team waiting in the lead helicopter. We will fly you directly to the finest private hospital in New York to treat those injuries. Then we will fly home to the palace. You will never have to work in a freezing bakery again. You will never want for anything. You are royalty. Come with me." Clara looked at the Queen's outstretched, jewel-adorned hand. It was an offer of absolute salvation. It was the fairy tale she had secretly dreamed about when she was a little girl suffering in dark, lonely foster homes. wealth power family, and a true identity. But then Clara looked up into Henry's eyes. Henry's expression was heartbreakingly stoic. He slowly began to loosen his grip on her waist, taking a tiny, agonizing step backward. He looked at his own dirty, calloused hands, and then at the incredibly wealthy monarch. He knew he was just a shipyard mechanic. He knew he could never offer her castles, endowments, or royal titles. He was fully prepared to let her go, sacrificing his own profound happiness so that she could finally have the extraordinary life she deserved. "Ooh, go, Clara." Henry whispered, his voice incredibly thick with unshed tears forcing a brave smile. "This is your family. This is your real life. You deserve all of this. I'll always love you. Always." Clara felt a sudden fierce fire ignite deep within her chest. It was the same stubborn fire that had kept her alive through 23 years of hardship. She violently reached out, grabbing Henry by the lapels of his rented, ill-fitting suit, and yanked him back toward her. Don't you dare," Clara said fiercely, tears streaming down her face as she looked directly into his eyes. "Don't you dare try to let me go, Henry Caldwell. You are my family. You were my family when I was nobody. You loved me when I had absolutely nothing. You stood in front of those guards to protect me. I am not going anywhere without you." Clara turned to face Queen Beatrice, her chin held high, radiating a natural, undeniable royal authority that she didn't even know she possessed. "Your Majesty," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady despite the violent trembling of her hands, "if I am truly your granddaughter, and if I am truly a princess of Valerius, then I will gladly come home with you to learn about my parents. I want to know where I came from, but I am not leaving this city as a single woman. This man is my heart. He is my soul. And if he is not welcome in your palace, then I will stay right here in Newport and bake bread for the rest of my life." The courtyard went deathly silent once more. The royal guards tensed, unsure of how the fierce monarch would react to being openly defied by the young girl she had just rescued. Queen Beatrice stared at Clara, her piercing blue eyes searching the young woman's determined face. Then the queen shifted her gaze to Henry. She looked at his scuffed steel-toe boots, his cheap rented suit, and the fresh bleeding bruise on his jaw where the guard had struck him. She saw the way he stood slightly in front of Clara, instinctively shielding her from the wind and the crowd. Slowly, the corners of the queen's mouth twitched upward. A genuine, radiant smile broke across her wrinkled face. "My dear child." Queen Beatrice laughed softly, a beautiful musical sound. "You truly are Edward's daughter. He defied the entire royal court to marry your mother, a commoner he loved with all his fiery heart. I would never dare repeat the terrible mistakes of the past by trying to tear true love apart." The queen stepped closer to Henry, leaning heavily on her silver cane. She looked the rugged mechanic up and down with intense approving scrutiny. "Mr. Caldwell," the queen said, her tone authoritative but deeply respectful, "you are clearly a man of tremendous honor and immense courage. You protected the crown princess when my own royal guards were miles away. You have proven your unwavering loyalty. I would be incredibly honored to welcome you into our family." Henry exhaled a massive, shuddering breath, the tension leaving his broad shoulders as he pulled Clara tightly against his chest. "Thank you, Your Majesty." He managed to say, his voice choked with profound emotion. However, Queen Beatrice continued, turning her sharp gaze toward the massive open doors of St. Jude's Cathedral. "There is one minor detail we must immediately address. I understand you two were scheduled to be married today." "We were," Clara said, wiping her eyes. "But Father Townsend canceled it. He gave our time slot to the Harrington family." "Yes. Well, the Harrington family has suddenly found themselves with a scheduling conflict." The queen said, a wicked, triumphant gleam in her eye. She gestured toward the magnificent flower-filled sanctuary. "And as the new primary owner of this cathedral, I believe the venue is currently open. I also happen to have brought the Archbishop of Valerius in the second helicopter. He is fully authorized to perform international royal unions." Clara gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, as she looked at the breathtakingly beautiful cathedral. Thousands of white orchids lined the aisle. The stained glass windows glowed brilliantly as the sun finally broke through the heavy gray autumn clouds. "Wait," Clara said, looking down at her torn, dirty thrift store dress. I I can't walk down that aisle looking like this. My dress is ruined. I'm covered in dirt." Queen Beatrice reached out gently, touching the torn, frayed lace on Clara's shoulder. "My darling Clarissa," the queen said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. "A true queen is not defined by the fabric she wears, but by the extraordinary strength of her spirit. You are wearing the dress you fought for. You are wearing the dress you chose for the man you love. There is absolutely nothing more beautiful or more regal in this entire world." The queen stepped back, gesturing grandly toward the cathedral doors. "Now," Queen Beatrice announced, her voice echoing with joyous, triumphant authority, "let us have a wedding." The heavy, intricately carved oak doors of St. Jude's Cathedral swung wide open, groaning softly on their ancient iron hinges. Inside the sanctuary was an overwhelming, breathtaking spectacle of opulent excess, originally designed to celebrate the superficial ego of a telecommunications billionaire. Thousands upon thousands of imported rare white orchids cascaded down the marble pillars and spilled out over the ends of the mahogany pews, their sweet, intoxicating fragrance completely saturating the cool, quiet air. Delicate crystal votives lined the center aisle, casting a warm, flickering, and ethereal glow across the imported Italian marble floors. It was a setting created for vanity, but in this singular, astonishing moment, it was violently repurposed for a miracle. From the second massive Sikorsky helicopter still idling in the cordoned-off courtyard, Archbishop Thomas Kensington of Valerius descended the extended ramp. He was a tall, imposing man with a kind, weathered face, wearing magnificent ceremonial robes of deep crimson and spun gold that instantly made Father Gregory Townsend's expensive vestments look like cheap amateur theater costumes. The archbishop was flanked by 4 solemn acolytes bearing the ancient, gilded ceremonial texts of the royal house. He did not pause to acknowledge the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi or the stunned, whispering crowds of Newport socialites pushed against the wrought iron gates. He moved with a sacred, unwavering purpose straight toward the cathedral doors. His eyes locked entirely on the young woman standing in the torn lace dress. Queen Beatrice stood at the base of the stone steps, her silver-tipped cane resting firmly on the cobblestone. She turned to the commander of her royal guard, Captain Arthur, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Immediately, the elite tactical unit moved into action. They seamlessly pushed the remaining hired private security guards entirely out of the courtyard, establishing an impenetrable militarized perimeter around the cathedral. The message was absolute. This was no longer a public Rhode Island street. For the next hour, the grounds of St. Jude's Cathedral were sovereign territory of the House of Valerius. Clara Higgins now. Princess Clarissa. Beatrice stood frozen at the threshold of the magnificent church. Her heart pounded furiously against her ribs, a wild, rhythmic drumbeat of disbelief and pure, unadulterated joy. She looked down at her battered knees, scraped raw from being violently shoved onto the granite steps, and then at the fraying, delicate lace of her $40 thrift store gown. The left sleeve hung completely loose, torn from the shoulder seam. Dirt and damp grit stained the bottom hem. Yet as she looked up into the vast, echoing chamber of the cathedral she had dreamed of since she was a lonely, abandoned child in a Boston foster home, she felt an incredible surging wave of absolute dignity. Henry Caldwell stood beside her, his large, grease-stained hands gently holding hers. His rented, ill-fitting charcoal suit was wrinkled and covered in dust from being tackled to the pavement. A dark, ugly purple bruise was already rapidly forming along his strong jawline where the aggressive security guard had struck him. He looked entirely out of place amidst the Gilded Age grandeur, the cascading white orchids, and the flickering crystal candles. Yet as Clara looked deeply into his warm, unwavering eyes, she realized he was the most magnificent, regal man she had ever known. He was her absolute anchor in a world that had suddenly violently spun entirely out of control. Are you ready for this? Henry whispered, his voice incredibly rough, filled with a mixture of overwhelming awe and deep, enduring love. He gently squeezed her fingers, grounding her amidst the surreal, chaotic whirlwind of the royal arrival. I've been ready to marry you since the day you walked into the harbor bakehouse, completely soaked in rain. Clara answered, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking through the lingering tears on her dirt-smudged face. Let's go. Normally, a royal wedding would dictate a massive orchestra, a grand choir, and months of intense, grueling rehearsals. There would be heads of state, foreign dignitaries, and a highly synchronized procession. Today, however, there was only the hauntingly beautiful, echoing silence of the empty cathedral, perfectly punctuated by the distant, rhythmic thumping of the helicopter rotors outside. Queen Beatrice walked slowly up the aisle, first her cane clicking rhythmically against the marble, her chin held impossibly high as she took her rightful place in the front pew, sitting exactly where the arrogant Richard Harrington had planned to sit. Then Clara and Henry began their extraordinary walk. They did not march to traditional music. They walked to the sound of their own footsteps, echoing through the cavernous vaulted sanctuary. As they passed the rows of empty mahogany pews, Clara allowed her fingertips to lightly graze the delicate imported white orchids that Chloe Harrington had so desperately demanded. The immense irony of the situation was completely intoxicating. The Newport elites had spent an absolute fortune to build a perfect, exclusive fortress of wealth, and now a shipyard mechanic and a bakery worker were casually strolling through it, claiming the grand prize without spending a single dime. Archbishop Kensington waited patiently at the altar beneath the magnificent, towering, stained glass depiction of the apostles. As Clara and Henry finally reached the sanctuary steps, the archbishop smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He did not see a dirty, bruised couple. He saw the miraculous, triumphant return of a lost dynasty. We gather here today not under the carefully constructed plans of mere men, but under the extraordinary, undeniable providence of God. The archbishop began, his rich, commanding baritone voice effortlessly filling every corner of the massive cathedral without the need for a microphone. We stand as witnesses to the restoration of what was violently stolen and the celebration of a love that has bravely survived the absolute darkest of shadows. The ceremony that followed was not the standard, rigidly brief parish liturgy Father Townsend would have lazily delivered. It was the ancient, deeply moving royal rite of Valerius, spoken partly in English and partly in rolling lyrical Latin. The archbishop spoke passionately of unbreakable duty, profound sacrifice, and the sacred, unyielding bonds that tie two completely separate souls together against the violent storms of the world. When the time came for the vows, Henry turned to fully face Clara. He took both of her trembling hands in his. He completely ignored the archbishop, the queen, and the magnificent surroundings. For Henry, the entire universe had instantly shrunk down to the incredible woman standing before him. Clara. Henry said, his voice cracking slightly with intense, overwhelming emotion. I promised you a life of love. I didn't know I would be promising it to a princess. But my vow doesn't change. I will protect you. I will honor you. I will stand between you and the absolute worst the world has to offer, exactly like I tried to do today. You are my home. You are my family, for as long as I draw breath. Clara choked back a powerful sob, tears freely flowing down her cheeks, washing away the dust from the courtyard. Henry, she whispered fiercely. When the world told me I was completely invisible, you saw me. When they told me I was absolutely worthless, you made me feel like a queen. I don't care about castles. I don't care about titles. My crown is you. I am yours completely and eternally. Henry reached into the pocket of his rented suit pants and pulled out the ring. It was not a multi-million-dollar flawless diamond from Tiffany & Company. It was a modest second-hand cubic zirconia set in a simple, slightly tarnished silver band that he had purchased from a local pawn shop by saving his overtime pay for 6 grueling months. As he slid the inexpensive ring onto the finger of the crown princess of Valerius, it instantly became the most incredibly priceless, treasured artifact in the entire history of the royal family. By the sacred power vested in me by the grace of God and the sovereign authority of the crown of Valerius. Archbishop Kensington announced, raising his hands toward the magnificent vaulted ceiling, "I now joyously pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Henry gently cupped Clara's face, incredibly mindful of her tears, and kissed her. It was a deep, passionate, and fiercely triumphant kiss. In the front pew, Queen Beatrice wept openly, her shaking hands clutching the silver handle of her cane, thanking the heavens that she had lived long enough to witness the spectacular resurrection of her family's legacy. The immediate aftermath of the royal wedding inside St. Jude's Cathedral was a seismic, catastrophic shockwave that violently shattered the carefully curated, deeply insulated world of Newport's elite society. By the time Clara and Henry finally emerged from the heavy oak doors, hand in hand as a fully legally married royal couple, the absolute chaos outside had reached a terrifying global crescendo. The story had not just leaked, it had explosively detonated across the international news networks. The paparazzi outside the wrought iron gates had rapidly uploaded the astonishing high-definition footage of Queen Beatrice kneeling before the poor bakery worker in the torn dress. Within 45 minutes, the incredibly dramatic events unfolding in Rhode Island completely dominated every single major television screen news outlet and social media platform from New York to London, Paris, and Tokyo. The world was completely mesmerized by the fairy tale revelation of the lost Princess Clarissa Beatrice. For the people who had cruelly mistreated her, however, the fairy tale instantly transformed into a waking, inescapable nightmare. Father Gregory Townsend found himself violently thrust into a personal hell of his own arrogant making. While the royal wedding took place inside the sanctuary, Townsend had frantically retreated to his lavishly decorated parish rectory, desperately attempting to contact his superiors at the Archdiocese of New England to spin the disastrous narrative. He sat behind his massive, expensive mahogany desk, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his mobile phone. When the local bishop finally answered the call, Townsend didn't even get a chance to open his mouth. "Gregory." The bishop's voice crackled through the speaker, utterly devoid of any sympathy, completely icy and rigidly professional. "Do not speak. You will simply listen. The global public relations nightmare you have intentionally ignited is completely unprecedented in modern church history. You explicitly denied the sacrament of holy matrimony to a vulnerable young couple strictly based on their financial status. You subsequently ordered private security to physically assault a sovereign royal heir on the consecrated steps of a cathedral. You are a disgrace to the cloth." "Your Grace, please," Townsend begged openly, weeping sweat staining his expensive silk collar. "I didn't know the Harrington family pressured me. It was a simple administrative oversight. The Royal Trust of Valerius has generously assumed complete total financial control of your entire parish." "Gregory," the bishop continued mercilessly, entirely ignoring the pathetic excuses. "Under the strict non-negotiable terms of their massive $20 million endowment, your immediate permanent removal is mandatory. Furthermore, an intense, thorough internal audit of your discretionary parish spending over the last decade has already officially commenced. Pack your personal belongings immediately. You have precisely 1 hour to vacate the premises before the royal security forces physically throw you onto the street. You are officially defrocked." The line went completely dead. Father Townsend dropped the phone, staring blankly at the dark, oak-paneled walls of his office. The wealthy elites he had shamelessly pandered to for 20 years would completely abandon him. He was a spectacular global pariah. He had literally traded his soul to protect the aesthetic of his church, and in doing so, he had lost absolutely everything. Across town, a different, equally brutal reckoning was unfolding. Richard Harrington, the arrogant telecommunications billionaire, was trapped in the back of his stretch limousine with his violently sobbing daughter, Chloe. They had fled the cathedral courtyard in absolute disgrace, desperately trying to escape the screaming paparazzi. As the limousine sped down the coastal highway toward their massive Gilded Age mansion, Richard's phone began to aggressively vibrate. It was his chief financial officer calling from the corporate headquarters in Manhattan. Richard, turn on the financial news right now? The CFO shouted absolute panic, lacing his urgent words. It's a complete bloodbath. Harrington scrambled to turn on the small built-in television monitor inside the vehicle. The stock ticker at the bottom of the screen was flashing a terrifying, bright, angry red. His company's shares were in free fall, plummeting faster than anything seen since the major economic crashes. What the hell is happening? Harrington roared, his face turning pale. The Valerius sovereign banking empire just publicly announced an immediate total severing of all international corporate partnerships with our firm, the CFO explained, rapidly, sounding completely breathless. They cited gross ethical violations and a complete failure of corporate morality. Our European distributors are frantically pulling out to avoid the wrath of the crown. We've lost $3 billion in market valuation in the last 20 minutes, Richard. What on earth did you do in Newport? Harrington stared blankly at the plunging numbers on the screen. He realized with absolute crushing dread that his daughter's petty, obnoxious tantrum over a floral arrangement and his own arrogant dismissal of the Queen had just completely destroyed his entire corporate empire. The House of Valerius did not simply demand apologies. They completely dismantled their enemies with ruthless, terrifying financial precision. Back at the magnificent cathedral, completely oblivious to the massive destruction of their cruel oppressors, Clara and Henry walked slowly toward the waiting black Sikorsky helicopters. The violent autumn wind whipped Clara's hair around her face, but she had never felt so incredibly peaceful. Queen Beatrice stood at the base of the helicopter ramp, smiling warmly as her newfound granddaughter approached. "Are you absolutely ready to go home, Princess?" the Queen asked softly. Clara looked back at the city of Newport. She looked at the distant, sprawling mansions resting on the grand cliffs, the very places where she had been treated as invisible, where her labor was exploited, and where her dreams were cruelly mocked. She was leaving it all behind, not as a broken victim, but as a triumphant survivor. She squeezed Henry's large, calloused hand tightly, feeling the solid, unbreakable strength of the man who loved her. "Yes, grandmother." Clara said the word, feeling strange but incredibly wonderful on her tongue. "We are ready." As the massive, powerful twin turbines roared to life, lifting the royal aircraft off the cobblestone courtyard, Clara looked out the small window. She watched the grand, imposing spires of St. Jude's Cathedral slowly shrink beneath them. She had finally gotten her dream wedding, but it was nothing like she had originally imagined. It was infinitely better, profoundly wilder, and perfectly real. The heavily armored Sikorsky helicopter lifted away from the chaotic church courtyard, instantly leaving behind the cruel judgment of Newport. Clara looked down at the rapidly shrinking coastal mansions, her heart hammering wildly against her ribcage. The magnificent reality of the situation was entirely overwhelming. She was no longer a discarded orphan, silently kneading dough in a freezing bakery. She was a royal heir, safely enveloped in the fierce protection of her newfound grandmother. Henry held her hand tightly, his bruised jaw aching, but his protective spirit completely unbroken. The dark, terrifying storms of their past were finally fading away. Queen Beatrice watched the young couple with a profound, tender affection. She slowly leaned forward, resting her frail hands over the handle of her silver cane. She began to speak of Clara's parents, Crown Prince Edward and Princess Catherine. They had been brave, visionary reformers who desperately wanted to modernize the ancient Valerian banking empire. They completely refused to bow to the corrupt, wealthy aristocrats who ruthlessly manipulated the royal parliament. The Queen explained with deep sorrow that their tragic accident was a carefully orchestrated assassination designed to eliminate the progressive bloodline and seize total control of the powerful throne. Clara listened intently, feeling a sudden, powerful surge of defiant anger. The political enemies of her family had intentionally thrown her into the brutal foster care system, condemning her to a life of poverty and isolation. They had stolen her childhood, hoping she would completely disappear into obscurity. But the broken silver locket had miraculously survived. The ancient crest had triggered the ultimate royal reckoning, as the helicopter smoothly docked inside a massive, privately chartered aircraft waiting on the airport tarmac. Clara silently vowed to fiercely honor her parents' legacy. She would never ever let the greedy aristocrats win again. The luxurious transatlantic flight was a surreal experience for the young couple. A dedicated team of highly trained medical professionals carefully cleaned and bandaged Clara's scraped knees. They gently treated the dark, ugly bruise on Henry's strong face. The private cabin was incredibly opulent, completely paneled in rich mahogany and soft velvet, a stark contrast to their tiny, drafty apartment above the noisy laundromat. Yet despite the staggering wealth completely surrounding them, Henry and Clara remained entirely grounded. They sat close together, softly whispering about their incredible, unpredictable future, finding deep, profound comfort strictly in the warmth of each other. However, the Queen abruptly shattered their peaceful moment with a severe, urgent warning. She explained that the capital city of Ethelgard was incredibly beautiful, but dangerously treacherous. The cruel architects of the original assassination plot were still actively operating within the government shadows. Specifically, a highly ambitious, deeply corrupt man named Lord Chancellor Croft had spent the last 2 decades ruthlessly consolidating power. Croft firmly believed that the royal bloodline would completely die with the elderly queen. He fully expected to seize absolute control of the sovereign nation upon her death. Clara's sudden, miraculous return would trigger massive political panic. As the massive aircraft slowly descended over the breathtaking, snow-capped Valyrian mountains, Clara felt a heavy burden of responsibility completely wash over her. The sprawling capital city finally appeared below them, featuring magnificent Gothic cathedrals sitting beside towering modern banking headquarters. The Grand Royal Palace dominated the entire landscape, heavily fortified and glittering under the bright morning sun. It was her true home, violently stolen from her decades ago. She took a deep breath, firmly gripping Henry's large, calloused hand. She was fully prepared to boldly face the hostile parliament and reclaim her stolen, rightful royal destiny right now. The official royal welcoming committee waiting on the private airport tarmac was entirely devoid of any genuine joy. Dozens of high-ranking government ministers stood in rigid, silent formation. Leading the hostile group was Lord Chancellor Croft himself. He was a tall, imposing man wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, possessing cold eyes that completely lacked any human empathy. As Queen Beatrice slowly descended the aircraft stairs, fiercely flanked by elite armed guards, Croft offered a deeply insincere, mocking bow. He immediately locked his cruel, calculating gaze onto Clara, openly sneering at her dirty, torn thrift store wedding dress today. Croft loudly addressed the Queen, entirely ignoring Clara and Henry. He arrogantly demanded an immediate halt to the royal succession protocol. He violently dismissed Clara as a pathetic common impostor, loudly claiming the broken silver locket was an elaborate forgery. Croft boldly insisted that the Parliament would never accept a random, uneducated American bakery worker as their future ruler without conducting an exhaustive independent genetic investigation. His voice echoed across the quiet tarmac, completely dripping with toxic disdain. He was desperately trying to stall the coronation, hoping to somehow manufacture enough political leverage to forcefully eliminate Clara once again today. Henry violently stepped forward, his fists tightly clenched, fully ready to physically defend his wife against the arrogant aristocrat. But Clara gently touched his strong arm, holding him back. She did not need Henry to fight this particular battle. She stepped forward, her emerald eyes completely ablaze with the fierce, undeniable authority of her royal bloodline. She stood perfectly straight, completely ignoring the torn lace hanging from her shoulder. She directly confronted the corrupt chancellor, completely matching his intense hostile stare without showing a single ounce of fear or hesitation. The entire tarmac fell into a completely stunned, absolute silence. Queen Beatrice sharply tapped her heavy silver cane against the concrete tarmac, violently shattering the tense silence. She looked at Croft with an expression of absolute terrifying disgust. The elderly monarch loudly announced that she was never foolish enough to return home without completely undeniable proof. The Queen dramatically revealed that her elite medical team had already secretly extracted Clara's genetic material during the long transatlantic flight. The sample was immediately processed and successfully verified against the highly secure royal database by 3 entirely separate independent international laboratories before the aircraft had even officially entered Valyrian sovereign airspace limits today. The arrogant chancellor completely panicked, desperately stammering out weak, pathetic objections. But the queen violently silenced him. She fiercely declared that her elite private investigators had finally located the deeply corrupt Boston social worker whom Croft had heavily bribed 23 years ago to successfully hide the infant princess. The terrified woman had officially confessed everything on secure video. Croft's entire sinister conspiracy was completely exposed to the light. The queen coldly signaled her elite security forces. Heavily armed royal guards immediately swarmed the terrified chancellor, violently placing him under permanent arrest for high treason and royal family assassination plots. The sudden, brutal arrest of the incredibly powerful chancellor sent a massive, terrifying shockwave entirely through the gathered parliament ministers. They immediately dropped to their knees on the cold concrete tarmac, completely submitting to the undeniable supreme authority of their returned princess. Clara watched the corrupt aristocrats openly tremble in absolute fear. The dark, violent shadows that had ruthlessly haunted her family for decades were completely eradicated in a single, glorious morning. She finally turned toward Henry, flashing a beautiful, victorious smile. They had spectacularly won the ultimate battle. The vast royal kingdom officially belonged to them forever right now. Later that evening, Princess Clarissa Beatrice finally walked through the massive, heavy gold doors of her true home. Thousands of loyal staff members warmly cheered her magnificent arrival. She immediately completely banned the toxic, arrogant, aristocratic traditions that had historically ruined the palace. Instead, she established massive global charity foundations heavily dedicated to completely reforming broken foster care systems worldwide. Henry happily traded his cheap rented suit for elegant royal attire, yet he frequently visited the massive palace garages to happily rebuild vintage automobile engines, alongside the local royal mechanics remaining completely true to his incredible humble working-class roots. Clara and Henry successfully built an incredibly beautiful, profoundly peaceful life, entirely based on true mutual respect and deep, enduring love. The cruel priest from Newport was permanently banished to total obscurity, completely ruined by his own disgusting greed. The arrogant billionaire family lost absolutely everything. Justice was finally spectacularly served. Every Sunday morning, the powerful crown princess of Valerius proudly entered the massive royal kitchens, happily covering her hands in white flour to bake fresh, delicious artisan bread for her entire dedicated staff, beautifully honoring the incredibly humble, resilient past that successfully forged her true, undeniable, magnificent royal strength. What an absolutely incredible conclusion to a truly unforgettable real-life story. From a rejected bakery worker in a torn thrift store dress to a ruling monarch dismantling a corrupt empire, Clara proved that true grace always defeats toxic arrogance. The greedy priest and the billionaire snobs finally got exactly what they deserved. If you loved watching karma deliver the ultimate justice to those who abuse their power, please like this video, share it to spread the inspiration, and subscribe for more amazing dramatic true stories every day.